They say Antarctica is lifeless, but that's not true. Beneath the ice, something ancient waits. We thought we'd made the discovery of a lifetime, a hidden cavern filled with alien pods. But the pods weren't dead, they were alive. And now, even thousands of miles away, I know I didn't escape them. They're still with me, waiting. When we first arrived at Halverson Station, Antarctica was everything I'd expected. White, endless, and utterly lifeless. The snow stretched forever in every direction, a blank slate under a grey sky. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the whole continent was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Our mission was simple, at least on paper: drill deep into the ice core and extract samples for climate data. But the ice doesn't give up its secrets easily. It groaned and cracked underfoot, shifting in ways that felt too deliberate for something inert. Adrian joked that it was a living thing, and we laughed. But by the second week, none of us were laughing anymore. The team was small, just the four of us. Adrian Falk, the biologist, was as excitable as a kid in a candy store, always bounding ahead with questions and theories. Natalie Reyes, the geologist, was quieter but sharp, her observations cutting through Adrian's chatter. Mark Toland, the engineer, was a gruff, practical guy who seemed to hate everything about the cold. And then there was me, Dr. Elaine Carter, a climatologist who should have stayed in my warm office, analyzing data instead of chasing it across the most desolate place on Earth. The day we found the cavern started like any other. Bitter cold, the drilling rig groaning under the strain, and the constant hum of the wind battering our temporary shelter. I remember Natalie shouting something, her voice muffled by the layers of fabric wrapped around her face. "We've hit something." "What kind of something?" Mark asked, stomping over. "It's not ice, it's hollow." I felt the first flicker of unease then, but I pushed it aside. We weren't treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists. Hollow pockets in the ice weren't unheard of. Melt layers, volcanic activity, even ancient lakes. But when the drill broke through, releasing a burst of warm, humid air, the unease turned to dread. Warm air. That didn't belong here. It took hours to widen the hole enough to lower a camera. The image that came back wasn't clear at first, just shadows and glints of light. But as the camera adjusted, the feed showed something none of us could explain. A cavern, massive and unnatural, its walls glowing faintly with streaks of blue and green bioluminescence. And in the center, arranged in perfect rows, were pods, organic, translucent, and each easily 8 feet tall. Adrian was the first to break the silence. "That's not natural." "Nothing about this is," I said, my throat dry. Against my better judgment, we went down. The cavern was massive, the air thick and humid, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland above. The walls pulsed faintly, a soft light illuminating the rows of pods. They looked alive, their translucent membranes slick with condensation. Inside, vague shapes were curled into fetal positions, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads too large, their faces featureless. "Dear God," Natalie whispered, her breath fogging the air. "What is this place?" Adrian approached one of the pods, his gloved hand hovering inches from the surface. "They're embryonic, developing." His voice was filled with awe, like a child discovering a long-lost toy. Mark grunted. "Developing into what? Let's pack it up and get the hell out of here." But Adrian wasn't listening. He pressed his hand against the pod, and that's when it happened. The pod shuddered beneath his touch, emitting a low hum that vibrated through the cavern. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a deep resonance that thrummed in my chest and made my teeth ache. The others felt it too. I could see it in their wide eyes and the way they flinched. "Did it just react to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It's alive, Adrian said, almost reverent. We should have left then. I know that now. But we didn't. We were scientists, and scientists don't run from discoveries. They document them, analyze them, explain them. Or at least, that's what I told myself as we set up equipment and took samples. That night, the first whisper came. It wasn't loud. In fact, I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all, just a faint murmur on the edge of my perception. But it was enough to wake me, my heart racing in the dark. "Adrian," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I stepped into the main room of the station and found him standing by the window, staring out at the hole we'd drilled. "What are you doing?" He turned slowly, his face pale and his eyes glassy. "I heard them." "Heard who?" "The pods. They're calling." I stared at him, dread pooling in my stomach. "You're just tired. Get some sleep." But he didn't sleep. None of us did. Over the next few days, things escalated. The pod's hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and into our heads. The others started acting strange. Adrian became obsessed, spending hours in the cavern, muttering to himself. Natalie grew paranoid, accusing Mark and me of hiding things from her. Mark, always the skeptic, started snapping at everyone, his temper boiling over at the smallest things. And then there were the hallucinations. At first they were fleeting, shadows in the corner of my eye, voices that sounded like my own but weren't. Then they became vivid. I saw my mother, long dead, standing at the edge of the cavern, her face twisted in pain. I heard her voice telling me to leave, to bury the pods before it was too late. I wasn't the only one seeing things. Natalie screamed one night, claiming Adrian had attacked her, but when we confronted him, he was curled up in his bunk, shaking and crying. "They're waking up," he whispered. "They're waking up, and they're in our heads." The first pod ruptured on the 5th day. I was in the cavern with Adrian when it happened. The membrane split with a wet, ripping sound, spilling a dark, viscous liquid onto the floor. The creature inside unfolded itself, its body twitching and shuddering. It was incomplete, its skin pale and patchy, its limbs too long, its face blank. But it moved, dragging itself toward us with jerky, unnatural motions. "Run!" Adrian breathed, his face white with terror. I didn't need to be told twice. The station was falling apart, and so were we. The creatures had started coming up from the cavern hours ago. At least I think it had been hours. Time didn't feel real anymore. The hum was louder now, vibrating in the walls, in my skull, making it almost impossible to think straight. Every shadow felt alive, every corner too dark. Natalie was gone. 1 minute she was in the lab, frantically trying to burn a sample we'd taken from the pods. The next, she was screaming, running into the storm outside. I saw her shape vanish into the white, and I knew she wasn't coming back. Mark was still in the control room when I found him, shouting into the radio. "Mayday! Halverson Station! Emergency evac! Repeat, emergency evac! Do you copy?" Static hissed back at him. The hum was eating the signal, warping it into something unintelligible. For a second, I thought I heard words in the static. Faint whispers, like the ones I'd heard in the cavern. "They're not coming," I said, my voice trembling. He spun around, his face pale, his eyes wild. "We can't just wait here to die." "No one's waiting," I snapped. "We're leaving. Now." He nodded, grabbing his emergency bag, but as we headed for the exit, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely, plunging us into darkness. And then we heard it, the slow, wet sound of something dragging itself down the hallway. Mark grabbed a flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark, but it only made things worse. The thing coming toward us was too big, too wrong. It was one of the creatures, but it wasn't like the others. This one had finished growing, its pale skin stretched tight over jagged bones, its limbs impossibly long, tipped with clawed fingers that scraped against the walls. Its head was featureless, except for two black pits where its eyes should have been. "Run!" Mark shouted, shoving me toward the emergency exit. It lunged. I heard him scream, a sickening crunch as it slammed into him. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled out into the snow, the storm swallowing me whole. The wind was a knife against my skin, the cold so intense it felt like my lungs were freezing with every breath. The storm howled, whipping the snow into a blinding blur. I couldn't see the station anymore. It was just me and the endless white. But I wasn't alone. I could still hear the hum, louder now, as if it was inside my head. And over it, faint and distant, I heard my name. "Elaine!" I turned, squinting into the storm. I saw a figure staggering toward me through the snow. At first, I thought it was Mark. He was alive. He'd gotten out. But as it got closer, I saw its movements weren't right. Too stiff, too mechanical. And then I realized it wasn't Mark. It wasn't even human. I ran, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The creature behind me didn't follow. It didn't need to. Its voice was in my head now, whispering things I didn't understand, but somehow felt true. "You were chosen. You belong to us." I don't remember how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The storm didn't let up, and the cold was dragging me down, every step harder than the last. I was so sure I was going to die out there. But then, through the white, I saw lights, faint and flickering, but real. It was the rescue team. They found me half buried in the snow, babbling nonsense, my body on the verge of shutting down. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Just flashes, being carried onto a helicopter, someone shouting orders, the hum still ringing in my ears even as they wrapped me in blankets. When I woke up in a hospital bed, they told me I'd been the only survivor. The station was gone, collapsed into a crevasse during the storm. There was no sign of Mark or Natalie, and no evidence of the cavern. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd escaped. But now sitting here in the safety of my apartment, far from the ice, I know that's not true. I still hear the hum, quiet, faint, always at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them, the pods, the creatures, the cavern, and I know they're not buried. Not really. They're in me.